Thank you very much, Charles. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome, everyone. Um, I will present my slides in the next 35 minutes and look forward to the discussion and questions from your side. So very quickly, what we will try to do is have a quick analysis of what happened on the 1st of March and during the elections. As you know, we had two elections. We had parliamentary elections and also elections to the so-called Assembly of Experts. Both of them are important, but as we will see, we have to basically assess what the impact on Iranian policies and strategies will be. I will share a quick snapshot of the economy because that's important to understand the sort of social mood, look at the political developments, and one important political process is obviously the succession scenarios for the supreme leader. I will share my analysis of the situation. Obviously, everyone wants to know where this current Iran-Israel confrontation will take us, whether there is a likelihood of a regional war or not. I will also share my analysis there, but I'm sure there will be also valuable comments and questions from the audience. And obviously, where Iran-US or generally where Iran is heading will be a key question. So let's set a baseline, I think, to understand what's happening in Iran and why the different scenarios may emerge. It's important to set a baseline, the situation before the elections on the 1st of March. So in domestic politics, it was clear over the past decade or so that the revolutionary guards, the so-called RGC, are gaining more and more sphere of influence. They were basically dominating key political decisions, uh, domestic decisions, cultural decisions, and other decisions. But one sort of dimension that was influencing a lot of these decisions was how to sort of prepare for a smooth transition from the current supreme leadership, Ayatollah Khamenei, to the next supreme leader. I remember very well in February 2016, when back then a new assembly of experts was elected. In his first speech to that assembly of experts, Khamenei predicted himself that that assembly, which is now out 8 years later, would elect his successor. Well, everyone was expecting that, but it didn't happen. Now a new assembly is in place, and obviously you can imagine that in all of these 8 years, everything was overshadowed by the desire to have a smooth transition, and we will look at the scenarios that are emerging in a few minutes. Regionally, I know that we are all now focused on the Iran-Israel dimension, but we should not forget that about a year ago, something very important happened, and that was the Iran-Saudi détente and the so-called neighborhood policy that Iran has adopted to improve relations with the immediate neighborhood and basically try to de-escalate. And in a way, that was working. And it's also interesting to realize that the Israeli attack on Hamas and Gaza and the Gaza conflict actually also brought the key players, especially Iran and Saudi Arabia, very close together. So it's very important to realize that Iran's President Raisi and Mohammed bin Salman only met after the Gaza conflict started to align more feasibly and more pragmatically on the regional policies. So a lot was happening in the region before the Gaza conflict, and especially before the recent escalation between Iran and Israel. Also, economically, it's important to realize that the Iranian economy has been doing very badly over the last few years. I will share some indicators with you in a minute. But one thing that's important, it's the first time that Iran has experienced an inflation above 30% for longer than 5 years. It's really the first time. And you can imagine how it is eating into purchasing power and into socioeconomic realities. And that was definitely one factor that played a major role in both the protests that we saw between 2022 and 2023, and also in the very low voter turnout on the 1st of March. And also socially, there is actually only one way to describe the social mood in Iran before the elections, and that was one of despair and hopelessness, especially considering that the 2022 protest movement, uh, known as the Women Life Freedom Movement, didn't achieve anything. It was a major uprising, and it did not lead to major political changes, and hence a lot of hopelessness, hence a lot of desire to migrate. So both socially and economically, a quite depressed situation, which, as I said, we have to take as the baseline before the 1 March elections. But let me share some economic facts with you. It's important to understand that, as I said, because of the inflationary development and because of the um, devaluation of the Iranian real, the graph you see on the right is basically the devaluation of the Iranian real since October 2019. You can see it has lost a lot of value, and you can see that the sort of value of 700,000 reals to $1 was reached when the attack happened, Iranian attack, and basically escalation with Israel. But you can see that the market has already started adjusting a little bit, as if like it is not worried as at a further or about a further escalation. But looking at the indicators, it's important to realize that the Iranian GDP has almost halved since 2017. In 2017, you remember that was the year after the implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal, when a lot of the sanctions had been lifted and Iran was exporting oil again. Iran was able to retrieve its assets from around the world, and the economy experienced a major growth. Back then, the GDP was estimated as at above $700 billion. In the year that just finished a month ago, the GDP is estimated to have been about $400 billion. So you can see sanctions, mismanagement, and the long list of internal ills in Iran, corruption, and so on, have basically wiped off about uh, yeah 40 to 50% of the Iranian economy, and that is felt by the society. It's not the inflation; it's also the fact that the economic opportunities are much less, even though, interestingly, as you can see, unemployment figures are slightly improving, going from about 10% 2-3 years ago to down up to 8%. But that's partly because as a consequence of external sanctions, Iran is putting a lot of emphasis on domestic capacity building, and obviously those jobs, mainly in the service sector, are helping the society to some degree. But youth unemployment at 15% is high, and it's definitely one engine of migration and a lot of socioeconomic developments. Let's move on. So what happened on the 1st of March? First of all, it was the lowest voter turnout in the history of the Islamic Republic, with about 41%. But even the figure of 41% is not the complete picture, because anything between 5 to 8% were invalid ballots. People have just went to the vote to be able to say that I participated, maybe civil servants, soldiers, and so on, who had to participate, but they just threw in invalid ballots. I will come back to the invalid ballots in a minute because it's important. But essentially, everyone agrees that the elections were engineered. They were engineered with the goal to consolidate the position of the hardline forces in Iran. We knew that since the election of Ebrahim Raisi in 2021, it was clear that the more hardline networks in Iran are basically dominating the political discourses, and that that attitude, both the attitude towards elections, the exclusion of more acceptable, maybe popularly more acceptable figures from the elections, and also the clampdown on social protest and various social movements um, since 2022, and even before that, has created a politically disengaged population, which is a new experience for the Islamic Republic. As I said, when we look at even just the indicator of voter participation, you realize this year was the lowest voter participation ever. But very important to understand that the highest voter turnout came in the provinces where we have a major diversity between different ethnic groups. Why this is important is that it's clear when we analyze the participation and the voter behavior, you realize that there is a clear competition between different ethnic groups rather than between different political orientations. You see the motivation for voters to go and participate to make sure that their own ethnic group is elected from that province or from that constituency, and that's an important element in understanding the future conflicts and competitions within the Iranian society, at least in these areas or provinces where we have major ethnic groups, not necessarily in a conflict, but in a competition situation for different economic interests and so on. One fact is when we ask ourselves, okay, what do people from the Paidari front, these are the main winners of this election, what do they represent? I think it's the way I would describe it is that the Paidari and other hardliners, their vision of the future of Iran is one of an Islamic rule. I try not to say a Taliban rule. It's not necessarily exactly what the Taliban are doing in Afghanistan, but it is not an Islamic republic, because basically these people wish to reduce the Republican element in the Islamic Republic, reduce the significance of elections, reduce the significance of elected authorities and elected institutions. They have a very different vision for the future of Iran, and they only look to cater the segment of the population that sort of is more conservative, more ideologically based. Where on the other side are people who still believe in the concept of an Islamic republic, that there should be elected authorities, that there should be elections, and that those elections should matter. I've put up two photos here to say that these could be the representatives of these two orientations. Saeed Jalili, the former nuclear negotiator during the Ahmadinejad years, is one of the sort of leaders, even though he didn't run for Majlis, but he's one of the leaders of this Paidari um, front and this sort of hardline element. And someone like Jawad Zarif, the former foreign minister, is a representative for those who say, no, we need a moderate interpretation of what the Islamic Republic, uh, the way it was created in 1979. So the more pro-Islamic Republic forces, their main complaint is that the Republican element has been diminished, and it's now all about Islamic authority and Islamic rule. And if you basically look at the last 10 years, the key issue is that the Islamic rule element or the Islamized element is gaining more and more power and more influence. And to use one word of one sort of reference that Jawad Zarif said as a foreign minister once, he said basically also in foreign policy, there was a distinction between what he called diplomacy as opposed to the field, the military field. And even in foreign policy, it was a question of whether the diplomats have the say, or those who are in the field, meaning the RGC Quds force, the regional forces that Iran has. And it's very interesting that in the most recent escalation with Israel, uh, the RGC, for the first time, the RGC actually summoned the Swiss ambassador to communicate a message to the Americans. It was not the foreign ministry. Even in the Raisi government, those elements, the hardliners who control this whole or dominate this whole process of Islamic rule, they even go as far as summoning an ambassador. So they're more and more playing the role of the foreign ministry, and you can imagine this similar in other areas as well. So what does that mean for political decisions? It's clear in the new Majlis, which will start operating from July, the more hardline elements have gained the upper hand. Fact is that the Majlis has very limited power when it comes to the most strategic decisions, whether it's, for example, economic planning, the sort of strategic planning, whether it's a foreign policy strategy, regional strategy, and so on. But the most important sphere of influence is they can impeach and sack and then also confirm ministers. You can see the footprint of these hardliners already in the Raisi government. You have a number of hardliners in the cabinet, and I can imagine that with the growing influence they will gain, they may actually start impeaching some new ministers or other ministers and imposing their own people on the government. On the other hand, the Majlis has to approve the annual budget. And in the annual budget is one of the main sources for a lot of the corrupt dealings in Iran, allocations, and some of these corrupt dealings have been exposed in recent years, and you can see how different networks of power try to abuse the resources that the government has to enrich their own networks. So there will be an impact, but it's not going to be an impact that will change sort of macro strategies, especially when it comes to security and foreign policy. But you can imagine that these hardliners will try to influence as many decisions as possible. For example, the Supreme National Security Council is a larger council that basically makes key decisions in the security and military and nuclear spheres. The parliament has 2 representatives in that, so they will definitely try to influence as much as possible. But as I said, it's not going to be a game-changing influence. Also, the question of the next Majlis speaker will be important. We will know in July. If Ghalibaf, the current Majlis speaker, is not re-elected, which could happen because not all the hardliners are in favor of Ghalibaf, and someone like Mr. Nabavian, whom I've put up here, becomes the next Majlis speaker, then you will realize that the footprint of these hardliners is heavier than maybe we expected. The key, that obviously the next Majlis speaker will be important also in some of the internal deliberations about the next supreme leader. And that is our next topic, which I think is important. I have basically created this table with 4 scenarios. I will say at the very beginning, first of all, the potential scenarios could be even more than 4. And secondly, it's not a foregone conclusion. This is very important to realize. All of those who say it's decided, it will be Mojtaba Khamenei or Ebrahim Raisi himself and so on, you just have to just read the history of the Islamic Republic and see how many surprises we have had. And when we try to find a common thread in all of those surprises, the key issue has always been the desire to continue the Islamic Republic, to survive as a regime that was produced by a revolution, and now claims that it is a key regional power. It's becoming more and more powerful despite sanctions. So continuation of this regime is an important goal for all the top leadership in Iran, and that will influence how they act in the next when the topic comes up, meaning when there is an election for the next supreme leader. So these are the scenarios. The top picture you see, and there is no specific order here. It's just, in my view, all of them are feasible. Mojtaba Khamenei's second son, who has been seems to be a preferred candidate by the RGC itself. Here I have to say, when I say RGC, even RGC is divided. Even there is no one view within the RGC. So parts of RGC, it's better to say those parts of RGC who have had a very dominant role over the past few years. He's obviously, many people have started, or when I say many people, stakeholders within the political structure in Iran, they have started to say that Mojtaba Khamenei is the Iranian version of MBS, is the Iranian sort of reformer who will come forward and change some of the realities. We don't know. I mean, these are all speculations. But what we know is that when the first leader of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini, when some people around him suggested to him that his son should be his successor, he rejected it flat and said, we did not change the regime so that we go from one monarchy to the next monarchy, because it would be a monarchy rule to have the son being the successor. So we don't know. Khamenei may say it's a good way to show continuity, to have my son as the next supreme leader. But we also don't. He may also react similar to Khomeini himself when he was about to die. So this is one scenario. The most obvious scenario, for one very specific reason I'll say in a minute, is Ebrahim Raisi himself. He seems to be very close to Khamenei. He's definitely, in terms of religious authority and religious position, he would be a person. I can tell you, being a Sayyid, being a descendant of the Prophet himself, that those who with a black turban are those, also helps. But then something else that helps is that Khamenei became the supreme leader in 1989 while he was the president. So the president himself, there is basically a precedence of presidents becoming the next supreme leader. Hence, Ebrahim Raisi in a good position. What works against him is that he is very, very because of the social and political and economic situation, he is very unpopular. And there is a desire within parts of the Islamic Republic to have a face that has some degree of popularity, some degree of network within the society as well. The third one is an unknown figure, but he has been mentioned by a number of domestic groups and stakeholders, is Mr. Arafi. He is an appointee of the supreme leader himself, and he heads an important organization, has a good network within the clergy. He seems to be the candidate of the senior clergy, which have lost significance, but as sort of there is the higher the RGC network position themselves and dominate the situation, the more the less power the clerical networks have. So they have also put up their candidate for the situation when the other networks can't maybe convince the entirety of the regime. A fourth scenario, initially when I created these scenarios, for the fourth scenario I mentioned as a surprise scenario without giving a name. But for you, I just wanted to attach a name for it, but consider that a surprise scenario and completely unexpected. Because when you talk to many people about Hassan Khomeini, who's the grandson of the first leader of the Islamic Republic, everyone dismisses it and says, well, he's too close to the reformists, he's too close to the young people, and so on. But fact is that he's still around. And to show what I mean, I just want to share one photograph with you. This is a meeting on the 3rd of April, so 2 weeks ago. This is the meeting, the sort of Ramadan meeting between the supreme leader and the high level political leaders in the country. Takes place every year, but the seating is different this year. If you look at this same meeting in previous years, you see right now, if unfortunately I can't show it with my cursor, but if you look at the sort of row of people who are sitting, the first one on the left is Ibrahim Raisi. The president is always the president. Doesn't matter who is president. The first person closest to Khamenei, to Sibri, is the president. But the others are important. For example, the second seated person is Hassan Khomeini. And he was never seated in that position before. He was always seated closer to the end of the queue, usually the second. And it's interesting, the third and the fourth white turbaned people are the head of the judiciary, Mohsen Ejei, and the head of the Expediency Council, Sadegh Larijani, who himself at some point had the claim to become the next supreme leader, but he's sort of more marginalized now. And the last person is Qalibov, the current head of parliament. The person sitting, the sixth person, is Ahmad Jannati, the very old head of the Guardian Council and head of the Assembly of Experts. He did not nominate himself for this year, so he will be out. And you can see also in the picture, he's more or less on his way out of this picture. But there are two other things. One is very close to the face of Khamenei, you actually see the face of Mujtaba Khamenei at the wall. That's the son who some people are trying to promote as the next supreme leader. It's very important position. He has appeared within the top leadership, not even in place. People were talking about him as a person operating in the background, but he's there. He's sort of background, but still not background. So very interesting photo. And the last statement about this photo is the military person sitting at the wall close to Jannati. That's the head of the RGC Quds force. That's Ismail Ghaneid, who leads the regional forces of Iran. It's very important because that seating has significance. It's important that it's not the head of the the head of the RGC. It's the head of the RGC Quds force, as if the Quds force is more important in the current regional situation that we have. So, in my view, we can obviously debate it in the question and answer session, but in my view, it's not a foregone conclusion. We may have a supreme leader who is not on this photo at all, but if it's one of these faces I shared with you, it will depend. And it's also important, Mr. Arafi, whom I presented as a candidate, is not even on this photo. He's not even in the closest circle around Khomeini. So let me go to the next one. So let's focus a bit on the Iran-Israel conflict. I know a lot of you have comments or questions about this. First of all, Iran and Israel have been engaged in what I would call a shadow war for a few years. It's nothing new. The shadow war itself is nothing new. But they have now moved to a direct military standoff. It was the Iranian attack on Israel was the first time that Iran attacked Israeli interests and Israeli targets from within Iran. Any attack before within that shadow war was always done through proxies. So Iran sort of was engaged in a shadow war, but was never engaged directly. What Iran thought, or Iran's reaction, was a direct result of of the fact that Israel crossed the red line. Israel attacked an Iranian consulate in Damascus, and Iran's reaction was, this is our consulate is like our own territory, and an attack and killing RGC commanders is an act of aggression that Iran has to respond to. It's very interesting that the Iranian diplomats say that if the UN Security Council would have immediately condemned the attack by Israel and would have sort of introduced maybe some restrictions or sanctions on Israel, the dynamics would have been different. And we have a historical precedence for that. In 1998, the back then Taliban government of Afghanistan actually killed 11 Iranian diplomats in Mazar-e-Sharif, and Iran actually mobilized its troops to attack Afghanistan. But then the UN Security Council condemned the attack, and basically Iran uh, decided not to attack. This time it was different, and Iran knew that it was changing the security dynamics in the region. Very interesting that Iran informed key forces that it is attacking, and it also started its drones in a way that everyone could have known that this attack was coming, because the Iranian desire, in my view, still is not to escalate, not to let the current conflict move towards a regional war, regional confrontation, something that most probably Netanyahu wants at this stage. He wants the narrative to move from the Israeli Gaza conflict, the sort of genocide in Gaza, to a regional war for which Iran is to blame, not Israel. So it's obviously, that's why I call it a war of narrative. Right now we have a war of narratives. You have different narratives. The Iranians will say, we achieved our goal. We wanted to show that we are capable of launching hundreds of missiles and drones at the same time, but we didn't want to escalate. The other side can say, Israel, Western governments can say, Iran is not capable of hurting Israel. There will be different analyses from military strategists and so on. I don't think it's a very clear picture. It's something that we need to watch, and we need to understand all the other sort of non-military, more political, regional reasons for some of the actions. But what is the outlook? I would say the optimistic outlook could be that the new situation, as I said, the dynamics of security in the region has changed, especially if we listen carefully to the Americans saying, if Israel responds to the Iranian attack, we are not going to be part of it. That is something very similar to what happened in 2019 between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The Iranians attacked a number of Saudi interests, and the US reaction was, it's your own problem, go deal with it. And I would say that US behavior, the sort of non-engagement from the US side in a security issue for Saudi Arabia, pushed the Saudis and also the Iranians to rethink their position, to rethink. I know from the Iranian side that it was the point when Iran did not look at Saudi Arabia as an extension of the US, and it paved the way for a different kind of engagement, leading finally to the détente that started last year, and it's going forward. Could something like that happen in Iran-Israel relations, where Iran sort of starts rethinking whether Israel is the extension of US interests in this region? I don't know. Well, we have to wait and see. The pessimistic outlook is Israel reacts, attacks the Iranian soil directly, and that could definitely make it very, very likely that we will see a regional war. As I told you, Iran doesn't want that. I don't think Israel would want that if it knew that the US is not going to support it. But I think we would speculate a lot if we say this is definitely not going to happen. It can happen, and it can also happen through a miscalculation. But fact is that it's not the most likely scenario. The most likely scenario, in my view, is that both of them will go back to their shadow war. Israel will attack Iranian interests again in the region, maybe assassinate some commanders of the RGC, and there is ongoing cyber attack and other sort of attacks between the two. So in my view, that's the most likely scenario. But as I said, miscalculations happen, and one miscalculation can certainly lead to an escalation, which hopefully none of us should support. With that, I'll move to my conclusions. So we asked this question, what is the impact of these elections? In my view, the 1 March elections were just a continuation of what had already started in 2021, which was gradual creeping of the more hardline elements and overtaking the key political processes in Iran. The proponents of the Islamic rule, in my view, rely on a minority of the society, not the majority. The majority don't want the continuation of the current governance structures. We can say a large segment are against the regime as a whole, but fact is also there is no clear alternative. That's why I'm saying the current governance structures are definitely very unpopular, and a large segment of the population don't want these. But the Islamic rule proponents also have their own social support. Even if you say from the 41% who participated in the election, 5-6% were participating reluctantly, still about 30 to 35% of the society align themselves with this view. But that is what I wanted to say about the invalid ballots. One of the interesting developments in the election was that a lot of people participated and they wrote the names of religious figures, imams, and so on the ballots. In my view, that was communicating to the regime as a whole, saying we don't mind the ideology, but we do mind the way you are managing this process, the political process. And that's why I wrote in the beginning that the lines between opponents and proponents of this regime are very blurry. There are lots of opponents who could be proponents, but if they moved back to the sort of Islamic Republic approach and gave more significance to elections and elected institutions. So as I explained, the impact of hardliners will be limited. They will definitely have some footprint, but not much. And that's why for the next few years, the key issue or the key focus will be on the types of policies we have seen in the past few years, which is on foreign policy, focusing on the region, moving closer to the Eastern powers. Iran has become a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a member of BRICS Plus. There's a lot more focus on developing economic and technological solutions with Eastern powers, with regional powers. There is a lot of focus on building domestic capacities to be able to manage the economy without without input from Western economies and governments. But the negative side of it is that there is still a lot of corruption, a lot of rent distribution, a lot of mismanagement, and so on. And that itself, and apart from that, the economic conditions that the country is facing will create a lot of potential for social unrest. The big event will be potentially either adjustment or discontinuation of the energy subsidies, which will definitely lead to social unrest. And every time we have to basically ask the strategic question, what does it mean for the political constellation? Will there be a solution that will attract people or not? So it's still a lot of uncertainties, But the only certainty that we can have at this stage is that the election of the successor to Ayatollah Khamenei will play a big role. It will either further deepen this current picture or open doors for some adjustments. And that obviously, as I said, is not a foregone conclusion. In terms of Israel and relations with Israel, relations with the US, and so on, Iran's sort of key strategy is to avoid an escalation, because a potential regional war with US participation will definitely put the regime under a lot of problems. And as I said, regime survival is key, both in the succession issue, but also in the security strategies that Iran has. I will stop here and look forward to your comments. You are on mute, Charles. Charles, you're on mute.
Thank you very much. We have a number of questions for you. We'll probably spend about 10 or 15 minutes on them, and we'll see how we go. The first one is, what are the possibilities of a radical regime change in Iran?
I think a regime change will fully depend on whether the Iranian opposition, whether they are inside Iran or outside Iran, can produce a real vision and a real alternative to the current regime. The majority of the people don't like the current regime, but the majority of the people also don't want to enter into a violent upheaval that without a clear outcome. There is no clear outcome, and the Iranians look at other examples in the region where there was a push, there were signs of a regime change, but the regime that followed the violent upheaval did not really fulfill expectations. Some may argue that the Islamic Revolution of 1979 was also exactly that. We went through a revolution thinking things will improve, and they didn't. So there will be a lot of hesitation unless an opposition leader and an opposition agenda emerges that can offer that vision. In my view, until then, what we will see in Iran will be civil disobedience, like we are seeing right now with a lot of, especially young women, not wearing the obligatory dress code. That kind of protest, that kind of disobedience will increase, but I don't think it will push the regime towards a complete collapse.
Okay, and what do you think about the impact of additional sanctions on Iran? Because obviously both Washington and Brussels seem to have them in mind.
Well, I mean, whoever suggests new sanctions doesn't seem to read the history of the past 20 years. I mean, Iran has been under sanctions since day one of the Islamic Republic, but especially in the past 20 years on the very heavy sanctions. Have any of these sanctions achieved their goals? I think sanctions will just essentially embolden the more hardline elements who are distrusting the Western powers and who just argue Iran has to completely disengage the West and just build more and more military might and military capacity. And today, Iran looks at itself there with a certain degree of fulfillment, that they say, despite all these sanctions, we have become a military power that can export arms and drones to Russia, to a world power. They sort of see themselves as the victors in this process, and I think additional sanctions will just have that impact and create more argument for the hardliners to control more and more processes. Unfortunately, with an outcome that will create more tension and more confrontation.
Okay, I mean, linked to that in a sense, how do you see the economy developing over the next year?
The Iranian economy I think we have to basically watch a number of parallel developments. Yes, on the one side, the sanctions have had a very negative impact on oil production, investments in the oil and gas sector, a lot of other technologies that Iran really needs. That's true. But there are other sort of upsides that are emerging in the Iranian economy. The push for economic survival and economic development from on a sort of micro level has turned the average Iranian company into an exporting company. It's very interesting. 10, 15 years ago, the average Iranian company was either focused on importing and becoming a representative for a foreign company, or on importing technology uh, to produce something for the domestic, at most for the regional market, but not exporters. Today, the average company is looking for ways to add value, to export, and that sort of creates a new dynamics. Yes, there is a loss on the one side, but there is a gain on the other side. So the outlook for the economy, it will experience sort of mediocre growth of 2-3% a year, which it has achieved over the past few years as well. Unfortunately, inflation and corruption, mismanagement, the whole sort of variety of different ills that the economy has will continue to put pressure on the people. But it's not. I mean, see, it's a surviving medium-sized economy, but it's not a collapsing one, because
No.
there are always elements that you can't really capture as much. What is the role of the Iranian diaspora? The sort of now apparently something like 7 million Iranians live outside Iran. And then you can imagine that they have an impact in terms of connectivity, in terms of financial flows, in terms of technological solutions, and so on. So it's an ambiguous process, but it is, as I said, those who argue we have to continue sanctioning Iran until the economy collapses, I don't think they'll achieve their goal.
Okay, turning towards foreign relations, or can you talk a little about Iran's control over its proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, etc.? Because I think a lot of that is misunderstood in the West in terms of
yeah.
how much
So
control
it's
Iran
a very
has.
important question. It's very interesting. I was at the Track 2 diplomatic meeting, and one of the representatives who had come from Iran explained it very well, that some of the interactions, especially after Qasem Soleimani was assassinated in January 2020, and then, as I showed you the picture, Ismail Qani became the head of the Quds force. Apparently, there was a major disagreement between him and Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah in Lebanon. And then after that, the Iranians had to sort of make a strategic decision in terms of relationships. And apparently, the decree coming from Mr. Khamenei himself was that Iran cannot decide for the proxies. The proxies decide themselves, and Iran supports them depending on what their decision has been. And this is actually very interesting. We can see right now with the actions by the Houthis, it's documented that Iran does not want the Houthis to attack ships, for example, in international waters. If for no other reason, Iran would do this to help China, who's sort of at a disadvantage in the current situation. But we see that the Houthis are not listening. The Houthis have also reached a stage where they can say we can make independent decision. So I would say the relationship is there. Iran is definitely still a strategic supporter of most of the proxies, but I don't think it's an absolute, at least from what I see and I hear from trusted interlocutors, it's not a situation where Iran controls its proxies. It has influence, but it has to bargain every time it wants its influence to be fully respected by the proxy.
Okay, can you talk a little about the relationship between Iran and both Russia and also China, and the way in which the East is so much more important now than the West?
Well, I mean, we have to realize that when the nuclear deal was signed in 2016, 2015, and then implemented in 2016, Iran had a long list of investment projects, both in the petroleum sector, but across the board. And the expectation was that mainly Western players, Western companies would come and would get involved and invest. When Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal in 2017, and Iran sort of stood there with this long list of projects and the desire to get foreign investment and foreign technology into these projects, the Western players sort of were not there anymore. And the only players who could have filled that gap would have been China, India, and Russia, those sort of larger players that could have brought the type of technology and the type of investment that Iran wanted. And the two who more or less responded positively to this were China and Russia for their own reasons. They also had their own both interest in terms of Iran being an exporter of energy to China, but also China and Russia both being in a situation in a sort of strategic competition with the US. Things obviously have changed since Russia invaded Ukraine. So other geopolitical matters are playing into the relationships as well. But from Iran's perspective, China and Russia were the key players to come and engage in the investments and projects that Iran really wanted. This hasn't really happened. You know, if you look at the real investment flows and a real engagement of Russian and Chinese companies in Iran, it's not to the extent that Iran was hoping to achieve. But it's happening. Iran doesn't have much of a choice. It's not necessarily also happening in the sectors that Iran wanted. For example, in the petroleum sector, Iran wanted foreign investment and foreign technology. When we look at the petroleum sectors between Iran and Russia, they are now engaged in a lot of swap deals and transit agreements and so on. That, as I said, was not what Iran wanted, but it is something. It's generating some economic impetus. I don't think Iran is fully committed to strategic relationships with China and Russia. There are still a lot of issues that they have in terms of security issues, in terms of triangle relationships. But I think it's safe to say that as long as the Western parties remain confrontational towards Iran, sanction Iran, and so on, Iran will look towards China and Russia as important economic partners, but potentially also important political partners, especially if Iran needs their votes or veto power in the United Nations Security Council and so on. So it's a complicated relationship, but it's not the strategic relationship that some people are describing. It's not. Some people are describing that China, Russia, and Iran have become the new sort of Eastern Bloc that is challenging the West. I don't think it has gone that far. As I explained, the selection of the next supreme leader may have a lot more to do with which direction Iran takes than the geopolitical situation itself.
Linked to that, I wonder if you could talk a little about the economic policies of the main players to become supreme leader, and what their attitude would be towards sanctions and also relations with other countries.
Yeah. So let's just quickly go through the list. If we look at Mojtaba Khamenei, and if we believe that he would be mainly in the sort of controlled or influenced by the RGC, then it would be a scenario Because we need sort of benchmarks to understand, I would say they are pushing Iran towards a scenario like Pakistan, a political structure that seems to be open but is not open because there is a military power that controls the key decisions and the key processes. They would like an Iran that sort of, it may actually, in terms of economy, in terms of global connections and interactions and trade, it may open up Iran to some degree. But it will be one where most of the interests, economic interests, are controlled by the RGC.
Okay.
Then Ebrahim Raisi, for me, Ebrahim Raisi and the thinking behind Ebrahim Raisi and his supporters is one that we can sort of compare a lot to Russia. Iran would become a little Russia. Again, oligarchs will control most of the economic interest. There will be some degree of private sector activity, but not much. They will trade with those countries that are open to trade with Iran. As I said, they will focus on immediate neighbors. They will focus on Eastern powers and so on. Mr. Arafi would be very similar if he becomes the supreme leader. I think he will sort of put a lot of emphasis on Islamic countries, on greater sort of domination of political discourses and economic discourses by the clergy, by Islamic values. And Hassan Khomeini would be extremely close to the more reformist individuals we know. I mean, the most recent one being Hassan Rouhani, but also Hassan Khomeini is very close to Mohammad Khatami, the reformist president who was Iran's president between 1997 and 2005. And remember, back then, Iran very effectively opened up to Western countries and Western economies. I'm not saying that Hassan Khomeini would be a repeat of Mohammad Khatami, but there will be a lot of impulses that will maybe shift Iran away from the Eastern alliance that the other, especially Ebrahim Raisi, would like. But I think there are so many unknowns right now. I mean, regional developments, technological developments, global and geopolitical developments. We just can identify some tendencies and not the complete picture.
Okay, two very quick last questions. One was the issue of Israel's rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. Do you think that Hamas's attack on Israel was partly fomented by that, and by how much did Iran get involved in that? And secondly, if there is a regional war, do you think it's going to create a civil war in Iran?
To the first question, I mean, yes, I think there are a lot of people who are looking for geostrategic, geopolitical reasons for what happened. First of all, I don't think the sort of Saudi-Israeli rapprochement was fully decided because there were so many moving parts. Saudi Arabia had also said that Israel has had to go back to the 1967 borders and a lot of conditions that would have been impossible, at least impossible for the current government in Israel. So describing the situation as if like that was a done deal and then Hamas came and disrupted it, I don't think so. What we know is that the new situation has created a completely new dynamics between Iran and Israel towards the Palestinian issue. I think there is a subtle sort of agreement from the Iranian side that if this happens, that Iran will go along with the Saudi peace plan for Israel and Palestine, because the Saudis are correctly insisting that there should be a political process now to find this resolution between Israel and Palestine. And I can tell you that Iran has never been this close to supporting that. They have not supported it officially, but we should remember Raisi traveled to Saudi Arabia when the Saudis invited the Islamic leaders to talk about Gaza. So the dynamics has changed. So whoever wants to find other sort of maybe other reasons for the current conflict, fact is that it is actually strengthening the alignment or the cooperation between Iran and Saudi Arabia on this issue. Secondly, it's extremely difficult to predict. If there is a regional war, we will have, I had written it in my presentation, but I didn't mention it. There will be people in Iran who will say, hopefully this will be the end of the Islamic Republic, but there will be also a lot of people who will be mobilized to defend Iran. And I don't see a civil war between the population. I think the population will align itself with what they see as the top priority for the country. There could be a more intense power struggle between the different networks I described, between those networks who want opening to the West and those who reject that and want an opening to the East. So that kind of a power struggle could emerge if the strategies are undecided. But a lot will also depend on when it happens, how well established and consolidated Khamenei is in his position, because he is the ultimate decision maker, and we have seen him. He has avoided escalation. He has avoided a regional war for the sake of regime stability, not anything else, for the sake of regime stability. So what the calculation is would be only speculation at this stage.